But what if I told you Dokken's biggest enemy wasn't drugs, or record labels, or even the hair metal backlash? It was Dokken. For decades, Don Dokken and George Lynch sabotaged each other with such precision you would think it was a competition. One punched the other in a limo before walking on stage to open for AC/DC. Another tried to trademark his own last name and legally got barred from using it. Every time the band got close to real success, somebody threw in a monkey wrench into the whole thing. And the fighting wasn't just backstage. They sued each other, stole each other's songs, lied about who wrote what. George said Don lived in a fancy apartment while the rest of them were stuck in a dump. Don said George snorted coke mid-show. There were 2 reunions that ended in fistfights, and somehow, through all of it, they kept playing shows. This is how a band with the hits, talent, and a major label deal blew it because they couldn't stop going to war with themselves.
Like, subscribe. Thank you.
Before Dokken had a lineup worth fighting over, Don Dokken was just grinding it out under the same name, 5 years deep, 2 tours of Germany behind him, doing whatever it took to keep the wheels turning. George Lynch and Mick Brown, meanwhile, were shredding in a separate unit called Exciter, chasing their own version of the dream. And then paths crossed. Don spotted both of them in different bands and clocked the talent immediately, though he had already heard the Lynch rumors. Moody, volatile, maybe a little explosive. And George Lynch, for his part, didn't hide the vibe either. He met Don, took one look, and pegged him as kind of weird and a little bit on the sleazy side. Perfect match. Still, something clicked. Eventually, Don dropped whatever name he was using and locked in on Dokken. Not for ego, he claimed, but because it had punch. Because it rhymed with rockin', because it sounded like a band that might actually get out alive. And in 1980, Don Dokken finally locked down a recording deal, Carrier Records out of Europe. The plan, fly to Germany, cut an album with producer Michael Wagner, and turn this half-formed dream into something actually real. He brought in Juan Crucier on bass, and as you know, Juan would end up playing with the band Rat. And he also made the call to Mick Brown. Brown was down, but only if George Lynch came too. Don hesitated. The tension was still there. But talent won out. Lynch could play the hell out of that guitar, and Don knew it, and he agreed. So Lynch and Brown signed on for what was supposed to be a simple deal. Show up, record the album, get paid $2,000 each. That's what they were promised. And when the smoke cleared, there was no money. No payout. Just an unpaid hotel bill and 2 band members ghosting out of Germany broke. They cut the first Dokken record in Dieter Dirk's studio near Cologne, a hollowed spot in Germany's rock history. Michael Wagner ran the boards. It should have been the start of something big. Instead, it set the tone for everything that came after. George Lynch, Mick Brown, Juan Crucier got stuffed in a crummy hotel, low on hot water, lower on respect, and Don Dokken was living lakeside in a plush apartment, all expenses mysteriously covered by a German girlfriend. Lynch clocked the setup immediately. There was a hierarchy there, and Don was at the top. From the jump, it was oil and fire. Lynch and Dokken were combustible from day one, and their egos weren't just big, they're infrastructure-sized, freaking semi-truck level. Every rehearsal was like a Cold War. Every studio session was a battle over turf. And Lynch later tried to sand down the edges in hindsight. Said they coexisted, worked hard, got the job done. And Don did not play along. He said it was tension from the very first note, always was, always will be. But before Dokken had a record deal, before they had a name anybody cared about, they already had a problem. And that problem had a name. Don Dokken. See, when Don flew out to Europe with a suitcase of demo tapes, he wasn't just shopping his band. He was shopping their songs under his name. Breaking the Chains, Paris is Burning. Tracks that would become early staples of Dokken's catalog were, according to Mick Brown, team efforts, or worse, outright swipes. Paris is Burning, in particular, was a song straight out of Exciter's live set, a Lynch and Brown creation that Don later claimed he wrote. Problem was, people remember Exciter playing it long before Don ever touched it. And this wasn't just a one-off squabble. This was the blueprint. Instead of building up a band, Don built a throne. He treated Lynch and Brown like session guys, not partners, using their material, locking down deals in his own name, and rewriting the origin story as he went. And Lynch never forgot it. Years later, he'd say it flat out. Don Dokken was a gifted manipulator. A guy who could lie, charm, and climb his way up using other people's songs and then act like it was all him. That was the fracture point. The reason Dokken as a band was already splintering before they even hit American soil. But before the ink dried on their first real deal, the cracks were already there. George Lynch bailed before the album even hit tape. He was out. Done with the politics, the posturing, the Don Dokken show. But once Don came back from Europe waving a real record deal and a management hookup with Q Prime, Lynch said, okay, fine, I'll come back. He didn't trust Don, didn't forget the slights, but a major label contract with Elektra was hard to walk away from. Lynch swallowed the bile and plugged back in. Juan Croucier didn't stick around either. He split, leaving the bass slot wide open. He ended up off in Ratland, as I told you before. That entered Jeff Pilson, a player, a writer, most importantly a peacemaker. Pilson would become the duct tape holding Lynch and Don together through most of the chaos. The diplomat. The guy caught in the middle when the other two were ready to kill each other. By late 83, they were officially back in business. Breaking the Chains got reissued by Elektra, and then immediately tanked like a turkey falling off of a building. The label nearly cut them loose on the spot, but it was Q Prime that kept them alive, talking Elektra off the ledge. And then it all flipped. Tooth and Nail hit in 84. Under Lock and Key followed in 85. The band caught fire. Radio hits, MTV rotation, world tours. Now they look like a band on the rise, but backstage it was trench warfare. Every success just raised the stakes and raised the tension. Don wanted control. Lynch wanted respect. And no one could forget how the whole thing started, with borrowed songs, busted promises, and a deal that always seemed to have one name written a little bigger than the rest. So while the band was torching up the charts, George Lynch was flipping through TV Guide, and that's where the titles came from, according to him anyway. Tooth and Nail, Without Warning, When Heaven Comes Down, Don't Close Your Eyes, pulled straight from old movie listings. Lynch wasn't trying to be poetic, he was mining late-night cable for anything that sounded badass. But once the songs were hits, suddenly nobody could agree on who actually wrote that. Don Dokken years later went on record saying he did the heavy lifting, claimed he wrote In My Dreams, Just Got Lucky, and Alone Again on his own, hits that define their sound. And then he said he gave away 75% of the royalties in a handshake-era agreement that split everything equally between the four members. At the time, he said it was about keeping the peace. In hindsight, Don called it stupid, said he lost millions playing nice with guys that he didn't even really like. So on one side, you got Lynch thumbing through a TV Guide, cranking out riffs. On the other, Don claiming that he wrote the hooks and got robbed by his own band. No matter what you believe, the tension didn't start with the money. The money just gave it teeth. Don said he wrote the hits and got screwed, and George Lynch called that bullshit. According to Lynch, the real engine behind Dokken's catalog wasn't Don, it was him and Jeff Pilson. The two of them would lock themselves away in a room and grind it out, woodshed for days, building the records piece by piece. Don would occasionally drop in with an idea or tweak a lyric, but the heavy lifting, according to them, it was George and Jeff. And Lynch wasn't just riffing either. He claimed deep involvement in the lyrics and melodies, especially on Tooth and Nail, where he says Don's role was minimal. And the way Lynch tells it, Don showed up at the finish line, slapped his name on the trophy. So it's two stories, Don swearing he gave away his songs for the sake of the band, Lynch insisting that Don barely wrote them in the first place. Either way, the narrative wasn't just tangled, it was freaking weaponized. Every hit came with a grudge, every royalty check, a new argument about who really earned it. And then Don came in with kind of a different story, claiming that he wrote most of Under Lock and Key and Tooth and Nail, then gave the royalties away out of goodwill. But then Jeff Pilson called bullshit, saying that Don had nothing to do with the Cornerstone tracks, like It's Not Love or Unchain the Night, Lightning Strikes Again. On Tooth and Nail, same deal. Don, according to Pilson, didn't write the title track, had no hand in the hooks, and where Don did contribute, Pilson gave him credit. Into the Fire, some key pieces of Alone Again, but that was about it. Pilson called him delusional. So by the mid-80s, Dokken was already pretty screwed. And behind all the backstabbing and credit grabs, there was one guy who wasn't fighting for the spotlight, Mick Brown. George Lynch admitted it. Most of the songs came from him and Jeff, but Mick was there in the room, throwing in riffs, dropping ideas, occasionally nudging a song in the right direction. Pilson backed that up, said Mick might not have written a quarter of the material, but when he did speak up, it mattered. Called him the guy with the perfect suggestion at the perfect moment. Pilson figured that Mick clocked in around 10 to 15% solidly. Not headline material, but absolutely part of the engine. And the royalty split, that was supposed to fix everything before it even started. Don Dokken confirmed it himself. Early on, they agreed to split songwriting royalties 4 ways, no matter who actually wrote what. May the best songs win, he said. Keep the peace. Keep the band together. And management pushed for it as well. They saw the storm coming from miles away. Too many egos, too much pride, too much risk. And Jeff Pilson said, hey, that's a brilliant idea. At the time, maybe it was, until the songs blew up, until the money showed up, until people started doing the math and realizing that they were either overpaid or getting robbed blind relatively. Don Dokken's version of the story always painted him as the lone monk in a den of rock star chaos. While the rest of the band was blitzed out of their minds, he said he was tucked away at his bunk with a paperback, sober and seething. And according to Don, the root of the dysfunction wasn't really ego or money, it was cocaine. He claimed that George Lynch, Jeff Pilson, Mick Brown were doing rails in hotel rooms, the back of buses, even during shows. Said George would vanish mid-set on the Monsters of Rock tour, duck behind his amp stack, and have his roadie feed him lines before diving back in to do a solo. But Don claimed it drove him crazy. But guys, you can't do coke for an hour and a half, he said, and nobody listened. He singled out Mick Brown, too, said he was constantly hungover, barely upright some mornings. And through it all, Don claimed he stayed clean. No coke, no party, just business, the odd man out. But Jeff Pilson didn't let that slide. He called Don's recent comments, He called Don's comments hostile and awfully convenient. Said it was a rewrite, Don using old dirt to frame himself as a clean-cut victim. Pilson didn't deny that drugs were around, but he also made it clear Don wasn't exactly living on vitamins and green juice either. And because Don wants to now be the hero doesn't mean that he was. He went on to say that Don was just pure sour grapes, and he and George Lynch both felt stung like Don had gone out of his way to tarnish them while propping himself up. And Don didn't deny it. If anything, he doubled down. He claimed if he had been to coke like the rest of them, maybe they would have gotten along better. Maybe the band would have held together longer. But he said nope, since he wasn't so much into that stuff, he was an outsider. The guy who said no while everybody else said yes, and it festered. By the time Back for the Attack rolled around in '87, the wheels were barely holding on. There were a whole ton of drugs, a whole ton of tension, and a band that was still only functioning because the machine was just way too big to stop. They were selling records, selling out shows, but completely falling apart at the same time. Somewhere in the middle of it, the question started to hang in the air. Was this still a band, or just some messed up gang of musicians just trying to make a paycheck? I mean, by the time this album was underway, Don Dokken was living in LA. The rest of the band had moved to Phoenix, and they kept it that way. Don said they didn't want him in the studio. He said he felt shut out, boxed in, intentionally sidelined. The vibe wasn't just bad, it was like radioactive. And Jeff Pilson would agree that the atmosphere was really tense, loaded with a lot of dysfunction, lack of cohesion. Recording was less of a process and more of just purely a scattered mess. They tracked the album in pieces across months in multiple studios while grinding through this grueling tour schedule. No central vision, just deadlines and damage control. But there were moments of real collaboration. Kiss of Death came out of that chaos, a really sharp track built around the looming AIDS crisis at the time. The band had said there just weren't enough moments like that. Too much distance, too many walls. Don tried to bring in a ballad. The rest of the band shut it down. He took that personally, and why wouldn't he? At that point, Rejection wasn't just about a song, it was about who was really calling the shots in the band that had become effectively 4 solo projects stitched together by a logo. And by 1988, the war inside of Dokken wasn't just verbal anymore, it went physical. In London, opening for AC/DC, George Lynch allegedly snapped. Inside a limo, with nowhere to run, he put Don Dokken in a headlock and started throwing punches. Security actually had to peel them apart. 10 minutes later, they walk on stage like nothing happened, playing a set for thousands while still spitting threats under their breath. That was the state of Dokken heading into the Monsters of Rock tour. Should have been a victory lap, stadium shows, massive crowds, biggest tour of their lives. But Don said the band just sucked. Night after night, they were following Metallica and just getting completely obliterated. And Don blamed the performances on hangovers and coke crashes, that others were just too wrecked to play straight. Meanwhile, he was spiraling, crippled with anxiety, popping Valiums, washing it down with booze, and still blaming George for the whole collapse. They're on the biggest stage in the world, and behind the curtain, it was just one missed punch away from total implosion. And by the end of Monsters of Rock, Dokken wasn't a band anymore. It's a hostage situation with a stage. And behind closed doors, Don Dokken was plotting his exit strategy. According to George Lynch, Don dropped the bomb right mid-tour. He wanted to take over the financial negotiations and rebrand the rest of them as hired guns, sidemen. The message was clear, Don up front, everybody else on payroll. Lynch was gutted. He fought for an equal split, and now the guy who once shared the stage was trying to buy it out from underneath him. Don didn't hide his cards. He allegedly told Jeff Pilson and Mick Brown they could stay if they wanted, but George, he didn't care if Lynch was in or out. It all came to a head after the final show of the tour. Don walked into the dressing room and issued that ultimatum. Either Lynch was out or he was. No more pretending, no more patching holes. Elektra Records panicked. They threw a $10 million offer on the table. 2 more albums just to keep the machine going. But Pilson and Brown actually backed George Lynch. They were done with Dawn, so they walked. He later said it wasn't about money. He said he picked happiness over greed, that he would have had a nervous breakdown if he kept going. It was obvious that the band had finally snapped under the weight of its own ego war. And either way, March 1989, it was official. Dokken was gone. And then the lawsuits. George Lynch, Jeff Pilson, Mick Brown were not about to let Don Dokken walk away with the brand. The man may have been named after him, but to them, Dokken was all 4 of them. So they sued. And in a twist that must have felt like some kind of whacked out joke, they won. At least at first. Don was barred from using his own last name. According to him, it was an elderly judge, 80 years old, couldn't name a single song who actually made the call. And the ruling wasn't just humiliating, it was strategically devastating. Don had a new project ready to go, backed by David Geffen, and suddenly he couldn't even slap Dokken on the cover. Geffen was pissed. Don was livid and still legally stuck. So eventually the judge settled the score. Nobody could use the name. Not Don, not the other 3. The whole brand was locked in limbo. And Don, still standing by his happiness over greed mantra, admitted that if he hadn't quit the band, he probably would have lost it anyway. Just slower, uglier, and on stage in front of thousands. So now you got the band over, the name was locked, everybody walked away pissed. Dokken broke apart, and with it, they also torched the payday. And George Lynch later admitted the whole thing backfired. The lawsuits, ego standoffs, name drama, just poisoned the well. While bands like Motley Crue and Anthrax were locking down monster deals in the early 90s, Dokken's fractured pieces were left scrambling. No major label was going to throw money at this kind of screwy scenario. So after the 89 split, everybody scattered. Don tried to go solo. George and Mick launched Lynch Mob. Jeff Pilson bounced around between projects, eventually landing with MSG and Dio. They all stayed busy, but nobody matched what Dokken had at its peak. And then in '94, the impossible happened. Classic lineup reunited. Don resisted it for years. He didn't want to be in the same room as George, let alone a studio. But the label pushed, and industry fixer John Colander got involved. He convinced Don it was worth trying. And Lynch for once played it cool. Said all the right things. Seemed mellow. For a minute, it looked like the past could stay buried. But with Dokken, peace was always just the calm before the next storm. The reunion had a pulse, but it was never going to have a heartbeat. Dysfunctional dropped in '95, and for a brief moment, it did feel like the magic was back. The album was tight, the reception was solid, the band was finally moving in the right direction, or so it seemed. And then came Japan. Mid-tour, Don pulls George aside to ask why the vibe was off. And Lynch didn't hesitate. He just pointed to the massive Dokken banner behind the stage and said, "That's the problem." Same name, same ego trip, 20 years in, and George still felt like a side player in somebody else's band. But they pushed forward anyway. Made another album, Shadowlife, in '97. And this time, it was George Lynch who seized the reign. Don called it a piece of crap. Lynch, according to the rumors, engineered it as a slow-motion demolition. Not an album, more of a takedown. The whole thing sounded like a band trying to erase itself in real time. And on tour, they barely spoke. Offstage, the old hostility simmered. Then it boiled over again. Don says George started acting up again and threw a punch. And that was it. Lynch claimed he didn't quit. He got a fax. One line. Signed by Don, Jeff, and Mick. He was out. So 1997, he's out of Dokken. Same story, different decade. The reunion was over and the band collapsed under the same weight it always did. 4 guys in a fist fight over whose name got printed bigger. By 2002, whatever was left of the Dokken brand was tangled in lawyers and bad blood. Jeff Pilson, the most diplomatic middleman, finally snapped. He filed a lawsuit against Don Dokken and Mick Brown, accusing them of breach of contract and demanding the dissolution of their musical and financial partnership. His claim, Don had pushed him out of the Long Way Home sessions and tour, branding him a no-show and slotting in a new bassist without cause. Pilson didn't just take offense, he took it to court. And the suit also aired out more dirt. Mick Brown allegedly bailed on a concert mid-tour, refused to finish the dates, and left Pilson holding the bag. Just a decade-long game of musical chairs with legal subpoenas attached. After that, reunion rumors would pop up like false starts, offers, meetings, phone calls, always ending in the same cycle of ego clashes and past grudges. Classic lineup just could not hold. And then 2009. For one brief night at the House of Blues in Anaheim, the original 80s lineup stood on stage again. 2 songs, no promises, just a flicker of once what was. Enough to spark nostalgia. Not enough to bury the record. Around 2016, the classic Dokken lineup gave it one last spin, not out of reconciliation but out of economics. The offer came in, a run of shows in Japan, plus one in the US, and the money was too good to ignore. Don Dokken didn't sugarcoat it. He said it outright. They paid a lot. And so they did it. No illusions of friendship, no dreams of a full reunion, just business. Jeff Tolson confirmed it, said from the start it was meant to be a limited run, no long-term plan or full-scale comeback. It's one final ride before closing the book for good. They even managed to write one new song together during the brief reunion. But it wasn't enough to restart the engine. The classic lineup of Dokken, lightning in a bottle, gas in a van, hit the stage one more time, took the check, and walked off, peacefully for once. But only because everybody knew exactly when it would end. And as of 2025, Dokken isn't dead, just a ghost of what it used to be. And the original members are still at war with the past. Don Dokken and George Lynch remain estranged, locked in a 40-year Cold War with brief, tense ceasefires. Lynch has openly said that they're not meant for each other, a polite way of saying he's done trying. Don, meanwhile, keeps getting offers for the classic lineup album, but shrugs them off, says he doesn't need the money. That hasn't stopped him from stirring the pot. Between late 23 and 24, Don went public again, claiming credit for more of the songwriting and rehashing the band's drug history. Jeff Tolson responded like a man who's had enough, called the comments ridiculous, sour grapes, and that Don was not being honest, just bitter about the whole thing and how it blew up. Lynch took it a step further, comparing Don's behavior to some kind of whacked-out politician and questioning whether Don could even sing well enough to justify making a new record. Meanwhile, Mick Brown is out of the picture. He quietly retired from drumming and unfortunately revealed that he's living with Parkinson's. Tolson says he's doing great, but it's clear his touring days are over. So here we are at the current version of Dokken, which carries on with Don at the helm, alongside John Levin, Chris McCarville, and BJ Zappa. They dropped their 13th studio album, Heaven Comes Down, in October 23 and continue to tour. John Levin, who's been Don's right-hand man since 2003, isn't just a guitar player, he's also an attorney, now representing other rock musicians off stage. Good to have friends in the business. And so the name lives on, the band lives on. Classic lineup, that ship did not sail. It exploded on the way out of the port. I'd love to say there's a happy ending to this story, but, that's always been the story. So to my subscribers, thank you so much. You friggin' rock. If you haven't had a chance to subscribe yet, get into a name custody battle with the subscribe button, and then do the same thing with the like button. Join the family. I want to thank you so much for watching.